That's a great angle. There you go, now you're a movie star. Yeah, and she is hiding over on the side of the room so that the camera won't get her. That's why she's sitting there, aren't you? See if this shows. Well, I thought I had Hill Center for a minute. I know I do. Hill Center, are you out there? Earth calling Hill Center. Tahoka, are you out there? Anybody? That's Hill Center, okay. They are there. All right. How about Tahoka? Are you out there somewhere? Somebody in Tahoka, keep the mic. There they are, in all their splendor. Post High School, Hill Center, Tahoka, and old Mr. House in the corner. Oh, there. That's the way I like it.
Hi, Mr. Miller.
How you doing? We may discover that as we move through, okay, that makes me feel better. I need to show you my, step off the camera for a minute there. I need to show you an important piece of study material. Come on, machine. Function. Sometimes I have to. There it is. Oh, it's upside down. There you go.
You could share those.
Well, I'll tell you what, since I can't reach you from here, what I will do is, Deantia, scoot over just a little bit.
Coming.
What we will do is show you that we're eating them for you. They're really good. Tahoka, don't give away your secret. The Krispy Kreme God visited Tahoka yesterday, so they know all about that. Got to get the Hill Center, got to get the Post. Well, good morning, Miss Bliss. I'm glad you could join us. I think you're still on time. You're not late.
There was an accident.
There was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, on the loop?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you came all the way around there?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. You weren't kidding. Oh my gosh.
I'm trying to show, on behalf of all of our friends out there in Never Never Land, that
Oh my goodness.
in the world they have donuts.
I cannot remember the last time I had a donut.
People who please the professor get donuts.
Hey, hey.
Okay. I guess we ought to do some work today. It is Friday, it's the last day of the week.
I guess so.
I want to go back and look at some things, as soon as I can get them to come up on the computer. We're going to plunge forward and talk about the British colonies today, or we'll start talking about them, and we'll destroy some of your favorite myths about some of the British colonies and certain people that appear in cartoon history made by Walt Disney and things like that. But before we do that, so that I can compare the British colonies and kind of how it was done, how they did it, I want to show you, go back and go back and look at the Spanish. We don't need to go back and look at the Portuguese because they don't figure in our story that much. We don't need to really look at the French. I'll explain why. Eventually we'll take a look at them. But in terms of statistics, the French weren't all that terribly significant at the beginning because there weren't that many there. If you're a budding CPA or an accountant or something like that, the numbers of the French were what they call statistically insignificant. Of course they are significant, but let's take a look at this. But I wanted to show you about the Spanish really quickly. Pay attention. Earth Calling Hail Center. Are you ready? Got your hair fixed up and all that now? Yeah. You forget, right? You brought up all your life looking at TV, and now you're looking at TV that looks back at you. You would not believe the things that people carelessly do in front of the screen that I can see because they forget that I'm looking at them. Like feet up on the table and things like that, which then comes to the attention of the principal and causes trouble. Not because of me, of course. I would never rat you out, but somebody will. Okay, let's look at the Spanish. You've got that PowerPoint in Unit 1, the Portuguese and Spanish, and I've kind of got a little sliver of that. And I just wanted to show you a couple slides at the end of that and make a point. And it has to do with some words and some what I call vulnerabilities. What do I mean vulnerabilities? I mean weak points that somebody could attack. Like if you're talking about COVID, you have vulnerabilities that disease can attack unless you build up your resistance to it. If you're talking about having a colony and you're going there to get wealth and money and things like that, your vulnerabilities are anything that make you liable to lose that wealth and things like that to somebody else, to a predator. The Spanish colonies had distinct vulnerabilities. One of them, let me see if I can get this to come up on the screen for you so you can see it on your blurry screen. I always have trouble figuring out whether it's my blurry eyes or the screen at this time of the morning, but anyway. One of the vulnerabilities, come on machine, function. Boy, I upset the machine when I put the Krispy Kreme up on it. There it is. Okay. You see that first line on there, it says sea dogs, spelled in a funny kind of way, kind of old-fashioned, and sea beggars. The sea dogs were British pirates, or privateers, if you want to put a nice word on it, when the Queen split the divvied the goodies with them. The sea beggars were the same, but they were Dutch. Now the story about the Dutch, for 80 years they're fighting for their independence. We only had to fight for 8 years, right? The Dutch had to fight against the Spanish army for 80 years to get their independence. They started sometime in the 1500s and they're going to be fighting all the way through until 1648 before they officially get their independence. It's kind of strange because they didn't really belong to Spain, but they were the personal property of the King of Spain, and he inherited it from his grandmother. Go figure. I wish my grandmother left me something like that. Well, maybe I wouldn't want. Holland wouldn't be bad. There's plenty of pretty girls there. Good cheese. They have a little bit of problem with flooding because they're below sea level. Anyway, the Dutch were pretty wealthy traders. They were very industrious people. You had to be industrious. You had to keep keeping the water out of the country, what have you. The only other country that traded as much over the water were the English. So they're always in competition. Since they belonged to the King of Spain, and since he was always broke, guess where he went to get his money? And the Dutch resented that. Also, after Martin Luther came along, when John Calvin came along, a lot of the Dutch decided they wanted to be Calvinists or followers of the Protestant side of the argument, which puts them at odds with the King of Spain, who is a very devout Catholic. So there's going to be this lack of friendship, and the king's going to send a trusted person over there to be the regent, his representative in the Low Countries. That's what Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg came out of. And there's a lady, and she wasn't that bad of a ruler, but the Dutch resented her because she wasn't one of them. And they always had to ask her permission for things. And finally, one of these pretty wealthy Dutch aristocrats makes the comment, you know, why do we have to beg you? We've got more money than you. We've got all that. What are we, beggars? And they thought about that, and they decided that they would start calling themselves the beggars. And they made their own little emblem, and it had a picture of a beggar's bag and a beggar's bowl, and I can't remember, crossed something else, you know, just like the heraldry that kings and people like that have, except theirs was a little strange. And they called themselves the beggars, and in Dutch that was the Guzen. But most of them made their money over the ocean. A lot of the most successful were sea captains and people like that, and they were the sea beggars, which made them the Waterguzen. And between them and the sea dogs, the Spanish had a lot of headaches, because the Spanish were getting things of high intrinsic value like gold and silver, which could be concentrated in a small area, which made it easier to steal. Big vulnerability of the Spanish. Another vulnerability the Spanish had was, initially at least, there weren't that many Spanish in the Americas. They were spread over a really, really big territory, all the way from present-day Mexico, all the way down to present-day Chile and Argentina. So they were kind of really, really outnumbered by the indigenous people, the people that already lived there. And the indigenous people didn't like them. I mean, there was a deep hatred which the Spaniards earned by their treatment of the indigenous people. Things like forcing them to convert to their religion, forcing them to work for them, all these things. So another vulnerability of the Spanish colonies was the fact that they always had to worry about the local people hating them. Now, that's going to occur with the British people too, but never with the depth of hatred that happened against the Spanish. And the other vulnerability they have is a more subtle one. Might remind you and give you nightmares and make you think about hails and enclosure and things like that. It was a domestic vulnerability. They never developed industry in their own country. Why? Because they had piles of gold and silver and things like that, so who needs to have an industry? But we'll find that wealth, if you want to call it wealth, isn't just a matter of piling up valuable stuff. Wealth is a matter of a cycle of trade and industry and things like that. And if you don't have it, you're never going to have a really strong economy, which means you're always going to be borrowing money, or the money you have is going to dribble out into somebody else's hands. Okay, so those are the weaknesses. There's another kind of weakness, and that was that their colonies were very, very rigidly controlled. Did you memorize all those words? Okay, moving right along. I'm glad you got them. I want you to look at some words, and we'll talk about this rigid control. The first one we studied already. That's the Reconquista. That's the action of the people on the Christian people on the Iberian Peninsula shoving the Moors off of the peninsula. And of course the process more or less ended with Granada in January of 1492. keep correcting this word, and I don't save it or something. The second word should read encomienda, with an A on the end of it. And that was how early on, if you think about Ferdinand and Isabella, they didn't have a lot of money. They want these guys to go and explore and do all those things, but they wanted them to pay their own way. So they promised them encomienda. And basically, that is, whatever you find, you can keep. Whatever territory you find, you conquer. Your relationship with the people there is this: you control the territory. The people that live there owe you either labor or they owe you money in place of labor. So some people early on got pretty darn wealthy. The explorers such as Cortez, Pizarro, people like that, made a lot of money at the beginning. And suddenly a little light bulb turned on in Seville in Spain, and the king realizes, whoops, they're making all the profit. We're supposed to profit out of this, not them. And so they canceled out the encomienda system and said, okay, while you're on the land, it's yours, but when you die, you don't pass it on to your children. It comes back to the crown. It belongs to the crown. Which is interesting because it never belonged to the crown to start with, right? But anyway, that's a different story for a different day. The third and fourth words are related. The bottom word on the pile is mita, and I mentioned it, and I'm sure you forgot about it last week. When we were talking about the various indigenous groups, the Incas used to have what they called a labor tax, and they forced each little village to contribute a certain amount of labor for a set period of time, so they wouldn't starve to death while they were doing it. And they called it the mita. And when the Spaniards came in and destroyed the Incas, that mita setup looked pretty good. I mean, the Spanish, when they first came there, they just took the gold and silver away from the people that were there. But eventually, when those people don't have any gold and silver anymore, they're going to have to start digging it out of the ground the way the Indians did. And so they're going to adopt the Incas' mita system, and they're going to call it the repartimiento. Sounds so official and nice, right? And basically that meant you owe us labor, kind of like the principles of the encomienda. You owe us labor. It's going to keep developing, though. Before long, it won't just be you owe us labor. After a while, it's going to be, if you make a product that you want to sell, you have to sell it through us. If you want to buy things, supplies and things like that, you have to buy them from our store. This is total economic domination, okay? Oh, that's so cool, Mr. Hunt. The Spanish were really cool people. I wonder if that ever happened in America. Not in your lifetime. There's a famous song by a guy named Tennessee Ernie Ford about coal miners called 16 Tons. And the refrain of it is, I owe my soul to the company store. Because those miners had no place to buy supplies or anything like that, and the store cleverly set the prices at about 5% more than the miners could afford, so they always had to sign for it on credit, and before long, the store owned them. So it's not just a Spanish thing, it's kind of a human failing that's done in a lot of places. It's a way of getting domination. So you've got reconquista, encomienda, remember it ends with an A, repartimiento and mita in your brain now. One more word, requerimiento. Boy, this is Spanish, Spanish 101. Well, maybe Spanish 202. Don't worry about all the things that are written on the slide there, if you go back and look. Just remember the word. Fancy yourself an Indian down somewhere in Cusco or something, living the normal life and all that, and then one day these funny guys with metal hats and long pikes and horses even, which you've never seen before in your life, come walking into your village, and one of them unrolls a big long scroll and starts spouting words that you don't understand because you don't speak Spanish. Blah, 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 and when he's done, he rolls it back up and says, like that, nods his head, and he's gone. What he's just done is read a declaration. Welcome. You might be interested to know that now you're subjects of the King of Spain, and now you're required to follow the laws of Spain. And among other things, you have to let our Catholic priests circulate freely in your area, etc., and we'll have further things for you to know later on. Anyone who doesn't like this, please step over there. And of course, the people that please stepped over there become very rare and maybe extinct after a while because the Spanish didn't put up with that. But this happened everywhere, this requerimiento. You're now Spanish, you got to follow the rules. Now maybe you can get an idea of why the local people didn't like them too much. And as I said, the Spanish are going to start from just taking stuff that the Indians had to having to develop themselves. And the big three that they're going to take, they start with gold, then silver, and finally, especially on the islands that the Spanish control in the Caribbean, sugar. That's what's going to call for the slaves. The first slaves are going to get to Hispaniola in about 1511. I know the book says 1520 something. Fui on the book. It's 1511. Those are just a few to start with. And in some places, they're going to use a lot of slaves. One thing they discovered was they couldn't use the slaves in the silver mines because the slaves weren't used to going in big holes in the ground like that, and they just didn't thrive down there. So they had to go back to using Indians. Oh, but Mr. Hunt, they weren't allowed to make slaves out of the Indians. Okay, so just change the name and say, I don't know, call him my loyal worker, who dare not go home unless I let him, because if he does, I'll kill him. But he's not a slave. Okay. Another weakness. The control of these colonies was pretty rigid. And it goes directly from the king to a group called the Council of the Indies over in Seville, Spain. They ran the colonies. The people that controlled the biggest units of the colonies were called viceroys. Under them you had people called audiencias or corregimientos or whatever. Don't worry about it too much. All I want you to know is that it's, a straight line top to bottom, all the way down to mayors and people like that. And they're all strictly in this hierarchy. So you always have to report through to the next guy up the totem pole, etc. Now, of course, the king's never going to totally trust the people that are working for him, so he also has an office called the Inspectorate, kind of what we call the IG. And at every level, from the viceroy, from the Council of the Indies, to the viceroys, to the audiencias, etc., all the way down to the mayors, you've got an inspector to spy on the guy that's running things to make sure he's not crooked. Okay? So that's two lines of control. And the third line of control is the church, and it has its own hierarchy from the cardinals to the bishops on down to the local priests. So three lines of control, relatively rigid. Rigidity is usually a weakness. Flexibility is usually a strength. Then you have a fairly rigid class system. At the top of the pile are the peninsulares. Can you figure out what that means? Just by what you know about Spain? What do we know about Spain? Where is Spain located? What is the name of the piece of land that Spain's on? The Iberian Peninsula. Does that give you a hint about what the peninsulares are? They're people who were born on the Iberian Peninsula. Those are the highest class. The next is a class called criollos, not creoles, that's a different word. A lot of people confuse them. Criollos are pure-blooded Spanish people, but they're born in the colonies. And the criollos don't like the peninsulares very much because the peninsulares are always lording it over them. Sometimes the criollos lie and say they were born on the peninsula too. Then below that you have the mestizos, and they're a mixture between Spanish and the indigenous people, the Indians. Now, if a mestizo looks white enough, He might tell a fib and say he's a Criollo. That's about the only way you get flexibility in that caste system. Then you have the Indians themselves, and then you have people who are mixed blood between Indian and the African slaves, and they're called the Damos. There's other names, but that's one of them. And finally, at the bottom of the pile, you get the slaves. Pretty rigid, it's very difficult, except in the examples I gave you where you tell a little fib here and there. We did that, by the way, in America too. If people wanted to be white and they looked white, they would lie about what else they had in them. And to tell you the truth, very few white people that are pure Anglo-Saxon or anything like that. Nowadays you can look at your DNA through Ancestry.com or something and find out all sorts of surprises that you're related to. But anyway, one way that you could move in between these castes was the church. Because I say a lot of bad things about the early church, but one good thing about the church was the church hierarchy valued people with brains. So you could be a pure-blooded Indian and move up in that church hierarchy with brain power, which you couldn't do through the other hierarchies. And maybe if you got rich enough, people would just forget about the caste system altogether. Okay. The other thing, and I think we talked about a little bit about the Spanish, was that they opened the door for this big mixing bowl to happen between the European continent, the African continent, and the American continents. And that's a mixture of people. It's a mixture of animals. Have you gone through this? Did I go through the animal exercise? Where did these animals come from? And that's kind of fun. Let's do that. It's Friday. How many people in Hale Center and Tahoka and Post eat okra? I used to eat okra whether I liked it or not. I didn't really like it because I thought it was kind of gooey and slimy. But my great aunt and uncle would put corn flour around it and fry the outside, but it was still gooey and slimy in the middle. Guess where that came from? Anyone tell me where the okra came from?
Africa.
It didn't come from America.
Africa?
Africa. Africa. You know the people in the southern part of Africa, their main thing of subsistence, and we like to say we're meat and potatoes people, they eat something called mealie meal. It's made from ground maize. Guess what? There was no maize in Africa. Maize came from the Americas. Where did horses come from? Ooh, gotcha. Somebody, come on, Hale Center, wake up. Where do horses come from? Try it again. You didn't hold it down long enough, and I didn't hear your...
Spain.
Yeah, let's be more general. Europe. Okay, good. Well done. You get points. Everybody in Hale Center applaud. Yeah, okay. Tahoka is falling asleep. Wake up, Tahoka. You guys are going to have to cut back on your donut intake. You know, you're looking very kind of lethargic. Anyway, what else? Let's think of something else. Goats, equines, that's horses, donkeys, things of that nature. Cows, pigs, all those creatures came from Europe. And we know that several of them, not only did they change people's diets when they arrived in the Americas, but they also changed the environment, don't they? Mm-hmm. I mean, we're still fighting pigs out here in Texas, right?
So many.
Do you guys know that? If you're ranch kids, you know it. You can go almost anywhere you want, knock on a rancher's door and say, is it all right if I go out and shoot pigs? And the rancher will say, have at it. Go for it. Because they destroy crops.
Yeah.
What do you think they did to the Indians' crops when they first got to the east coast of America? Didn't make the Indians real happy. Because the Indians didn't have fences. So you're mixing people, which is called miscegenation, where you mix races. You're bringing new animals in, which changes economies. Look, we had a number of North American Indian tribes who became splendid horsemen and all of that. And you tend to think of that was forever, but it wasn't. It wasn't until the Spanish started letting their horses go. There's a little secret about the Spanish and the Arabs in the old days. They didn't castrate their horses. They thought that ruined the horse. We've changed our mind about that. And when horses got loose, they did what horses do. And before long, you've got thousands and thousands of wild horses out there. Mommy, what's castration mean? I didn't mean to shock anyone. Also, microbes. Influenza, smallpox, measles, all probably came from Europe. There's a big argument on History Channel about where syphilis came from. The French say it came from Spain, the Spanish say it came from France. You've ever heard of the Spanish flu, by the way? There's no one that can prove that came from Spain. They got that name from the French and the British. It may have even come from America, we don't know. Who knows? All of these things change economies, change people, change culture. For example, the Europeans came to North America. A whole lot of the Iroquoian speakers and the Algonquian speakers were matriarchal tribes. That meant they passed hereditary, they passed their property and all of that through the line of their mother, not through the line of their father. And a lot of the Iroquoian tribes, and I call them Iroquois because they speak it, not because that's the name of their tribe, the women chose the chiefs. Now the Europeans come over, and who are they going to negotiate with? They're European style, right? So immediately they're going to negotiate with some guy that's running everything. You get a little disconnect there, don't you? So if the Indians want to negotiate with Europeans, they're going to have to start changing their own culture a little bit. And there's a lot of examples like that. Religion, of course. And there's something else that happened in Africa, it happened in the Americas, and that's called dependency. When a culture that had certain things that other cultures wanted presented itself there, and the other culture wants to get that, and that other culture has to rely on them for a supply of it. I'm thinking of the American Indians, for example. Metal things. They didn't work metal. So metal things like cooking utensils, weapons, eventually firearms, things like that. If they wanted them, they had to get them from the Europeans. So they became dependent on the Europeans for the supply, and that makes them weaker than the Europeans. It wasn't because they were intellectually weaker, believe me. Same thing in Africa. What did the African kings all become dependent on? What was their main source of income for 200 years?
Slavery.
What was the valuable thing they had that they could get goodies like good material and weapons and things like that from the Europeans what am I saying here? Slaves. And the African kings became so dependent on slave income that became almost their only income. Can you imagine what it did to all those kingdoms, their economies, when suddenly in the 1830s it became a no-no to have slaves around the world? Their economies crashed. So there was a dependency thing that was developed, and the Spaniards probably developed it a little bit in the Americas, but probably not as much as the British and the French did when we get to them. Okay, let's go. Enough about looking backwards. Let's look at start looking at the English explorations in colonies. They were very, very much aware of what the Spanish and the Portuguese were doing, But English kings were busy consolidating power because they were kind of a new ruling family, the Tudors, starting out with, come on slide, pop up there. Starting with old Henry VII, then Henry VIII. The Tudors were from Henry VII all down to Elizabeth. She was the last of the Tudors. She had no children, no direct heirs. House of the Stuart followed. We'll skip over that, go back to it later. Tudor monarchs are busy getting unity in their own country. So even though they're aware of, let's talk about this from the point of view of Henry VII. He wants to have wealth and prosperity. He needs to consolidate power inside his own country so he can really control it. He's aware that people are getting great wealth from the Far East. Not just the wealth and the stuff that they bring from the Far East, but the actual trading of it. But he's also aware that it's difficult now to go across the Mediterranean because the Ottoman Empire is in the way, and you can't go around Africa because the Portuguese are in the way, and you can't go around the southern part of the Americas because the Spanish are in the way. Maybe I'll worry about this later. Well, I'll send somebody out. Maybe there's a way around the north side of North America. If you remember from Hackley, he mentioned somewhere buried in the middle of that writing, that essay, the Northwest Passage. And they all thought that there was some people thought it was the St. Lawrence River that would go straight across, you could cut across it and get to China. And the fact of the matter is they're right. There is a way to go around the north side of the American continent and get to China. The problem is it's frozen. Well, it may not be very much longer, but it is now. But the French and the English are going to start competing with each other trying to find the Northwest Passage. When they get done with their religious wars and consolidation of power and things like that. And that's not going to start for the English until Elizabeth the Queen, until Henry VIII dies. Let's talk about old Henry VIII just for a minute. There he is, Henry VIII. There's the Pope, one of the popes that he didn't like very much, Clement II. Remember, Henry was a good Catholic boy. When Martin Luther came around and they started the fight between the Protestants and the Catholics, Henry stayed loyal to the Catholics. The Pope said, you're a defender of the faith, you know, you're wonderful and all that. Henry VIII had a little problem. He was a political thinker. He wasn't a philosopher as such. He wasn't a real deep religious thinker. He was a political thinker. Pragmatic. Okay, Pope, I did you a favor. I need some help. Here's my problem. My wife, Catherine, is not giving me a boy child. In order for me to maintain power, I have to have a male heir. A king that can't produce a male heir is considered weak. I want to trade her in for a new model. That's a little bit crass that way, isn't it? That's how my grandfather always talked about. I'm going to trade you in for a new model. Can you declare, of course he was a good Catholic boy, so he couldn't get a divorce. Can you declare my marriage as invalid? Can you annul my marriage? Now, technically, a marriage that's annulled is one that's never been consummated. We don't need to get too deep into that, but you can ask your mommy and daddy. Henry already had a daughter with Catherine, but now he wants to dump her. There's a problem. There's a political problem. Catherine is one of the daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella. She's the younger sister of Joanna, who's going to become the queen of the whole mess later on. She's also the aunt of a fellow by the name of Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, who pays the salary of the Pope, more or less, and she doesn't want to be divorced. So Pope Clement says, sorry old boy, I'd like to help you out, but, well, he didn't say it that way. He just didn't give him permission to annul his marriage, and Henry finally got angry. And in the 1530s, he's going to say, okay, our church isn't your church anymore. The Pope's not in charge of our church. The king will be. And then he had his Archbishop of Canterbury annul his marriage. Here's your chance, guys out there in Never Never Land, to say a bad word in class. Since the marriage never existed, what does that make of the daughter named Mary? What is Mary now? Since according to the king, he wasn't married to her mother. Nobody's yelling it out. Are you afraid? Afraid you're going to get spanked? Let's just say illegitimate. Okay. Nowadays people don't worry about that very much. Back then they did. So he's going to marry another gal named Anne Boleyn. She was a cutie. He's been kind of messing around. Well, he wasn't messing around with Anne. He was messing around with Anne's big sister. She was pretty good, and then he noticed the younger sister. So it did switch. Younger sister was a little bit more rigid about her resistance, and so he had to marry her. She was married to him for about 1,001 days. She produced a daughter. Hallelujah. I want a son. She produces a stillborn son. What's wrong here? Henry's going, I think I'm going to have to change again. They discover that Anne Boleyn hasn't been totally faithful to the king. That's what they say anyway. They find her guilty of treason. He's not just a common guy. If you betray the king, that's treason. And so he annuls the marriage, and then he has her head chopped off for good measure. I'll play the song about Anne Boleyn sometime for you. And he marries another gal, and her name is Jane Seymour. And Jane, believe it or not, produces him with a boy child. And then she dies. Oh, beats having your head chopped off. And they all say that, that was the woman that he really loved. Who knows? So now he's got a son named Edward. By the way, since Anne Boleyn's marriage was annulled, what does that make her daughter Elizabeth? The same thing as Catherine's daughter Mary. Only Catherine's daughter was brought up by Catherine, so she's a good Catholic child. Elizabeth is brought up by the king in his court, and so she's a good Protestant child. Then on we go. He needs another wife. The love of his life, Jane Seymour, died. What a tragedy. Then he goes shopping for a wife. And he sends his people far and wide, and they find this very eligible, probably meaning that she had a lot of money, woman by the name of Anne of Cleves. And he says, well, what's she look like? And of course, they don't, you can't do the little thing with your iPhone back then. So someone brought a painting, and she looked okay. So they said, well, tell her to come on over to England, and I'll marry her. And she wouldn't come over there unless she was married. And he didn't dare to leave England because he's trying to control England. So we got married by proxy. Someone that stands in for you, and does all the formalities. But when she showed up in England, oops, the artist lied a little bit. I think this marriage was annulled, and I think it was a legitimate annulment. I don't think he was ever in a room alone with her. She becomes the king's, quote, sister, royal sister. He gives her a palace. Now, remember Catherine, after he divorced her, he put her in one palace. Now he's going to have to put Anne of Cleves in another palace. And he treats her very well all of her life. And she, by the way, treats his two illegitimate daughters very well and persuades him to legitimatize them. If you're king, right? You just, scratch out illegitimate, write in legitimate, and that's that. Now they're legitimate daughters. But they're not number one in the line because he's got a boy child. He needs another wife. It's a lonely world. He finds her real hard. Her name is Catherine Howard. She was a divorcee. Okay. They got married. Then Catherine Howard remained a hottie. In fact, she got caught being hot in a lot of places that wasn't the king's bedroom. She is now guilty of treason. Schlunk goes another head. And he marries a woman named Catherine Parr, and Catherine Parr outlives him. She survived. English school kids, when they study this, they say, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's how they remember the 6 wives. And this gets us, that long story gets us all the way to Queen Elizabeth, arguably the greatest monarch that England ever had. The queen named after her, Queen Elizabeth II, is the queen who has been on the throne longer than any monarch of England in history. All of my life. Well, I was alive when she became queen.
Yeah.
But loved and respected, and the Lord knows what's going to happen when she dies.
Oh my goodness.
So, Henry kicks off. His son Edward, who's a pretty young guy, I think he was about 12 or 13, becomes the king. He's going to die by the time he's 16. That wasn't much of a kingship. He designated one of his cousins that he really liked to be his successor. Her name was Jane Grey, Lady Jane Grey. But his daughter Mary has other thoughts, and his daughter Mary has more supporters, and Jane Grey lasts about 5 days. Goes off to the Tower of London, and you know what happened to her. Schlonk. There goes another head. Mary's a Catholic girl, though. Whoops. England's been converted to Protestantism. The English church version of Protestantism is almost identical to Catholicism, except that the king's in charge. Mary says anybody that's going to be a Protestant, you're in danger, and she backs up those words, and she copies her father's political technique, schlonk, schlonk, schlonk. There goes a head here and there. If you go to some of the old palaces or castles in England, a lot of them have their own little church in it, and a lot of times somewhere around that little church is a place where you could hide, so that if the Mary's people came to see if you were, if there was a Protestant around, they wouldn't be able to find you. And of course she got a nickname for that, didn't she? A nickname that's now used as the name of a Sunday morning alcoholic beverage made with gin,
Bloody Marys.
tomato juice, and if it's really good, with some Tabasco sauce and a slice of celery.
And some olives.
Mr. Hunt is starting to drool. Anyway, called the Bloody Mary. Called the Bloody Mary. Okay. She only lives, thank heavens, for 5 years, but she does some damage. She kills a lot of people. That's why she got that name. Trying to convert everyone back to Catholic. And she also did something else that's very significant. She got married. She married a fellow named Philip. I've got nothing against guys named Philip, but this guy was named Philip, the second king of Spain. Oops. Now he's the co-ruler of England as well, or at least he thinks he is. He didn't spend much time in England. They didn't have any children. She fancied herself pregnant one time, and it turned out to be her imagination. And she died. Now we've got Elizabeth, who's been she was smart. She kept her mouth shut. She didn't act ambitious or anything like that. She survived all these other things that happened, and now she's on the throne. England is still a kind of a number 2 level country. It's not a first-rate country yet. She's going to bring it to that level. Now, Philip of Spain thinks, well, I don't want to cut this link, to controlling England, so he sends a little letter to Elizabeth, said, let's get together. And Elizabeth tells him something along the line of take a long walk off a short pier, and that was the end of that. Elizabeth never did take a husband. So all of you who put on the quiz that Hakluyt's letter was to the king and queen lost some points on that, because there was no king. In fact, Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. I'm not sure if that was technically true, but she certainly didn't have a husband. There's Mary. Here comes Elizabeth. Woe in the tower. One of the things she did, well, she was a good, oops, I'm looking at the screen and you're not seeing it. One of the things that Elizabeth did was she administered her country very well. And she understood politics as well as her father and her grandfather did. She developed what she called the middle road, via media. What does that mean? Let's not have wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. Let's kind of go down the middle, which all good political leaders do, including all the good presidents in the United States. Sooner or later they figure out they can't be far out to the left or far out to the right. They gotta go down the middle. Well, she did that. She followed Protestant doctrine because the country was Protestant, but she let the Protestants in the Church of England still have the same kind of masses and all that that they had if they were Catholics. And she got rid of all the fighting. Oh, she did have a little problem with the Pope. Remember, the Pope still considered her to be illegitimate. And she thumbed her nose at him, so he excommunicated her. It didn't seem to worry her too much. She's going to align
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
with those countries, such as the Dutch and people like that, who opposed this big Catholic machine, including the Holy Roman Empire in Spain and France. Let's go back and look at what her grandfather did. Her grandfather was interested in the Northwest Passage, Henry VII. Didn't do much about it, but he did commission a guy named John Cabot. His real name was Giovanni Caboto. He was not English. He was Italian. There weren't any Englishmen that were crazy enough to do this yet. He's going to go and explore in the Americas. He'll support some other explorers too, that we don't talk about that much. Then there's another Englishman that's going to explore. His name is Henry Hudson. He didn't explore for the English though. He explored for the Dutch. Go figure. They called him Heinrich Hudson. And he got a commission to go explore the coast of the Americas, of North America. He's going to go around where New York is, Long Island, the mouth of the Hudson River, which will, of course, eventually be named after him. And then he's going to go back to Europe and report, and he claims all that territory for the Dutch, by the way. And they're going to eventually establish an area, a whole area there called New Amsterdam, or New Holland, the New Netherlands, and then their capital city will be New Amsterdam. And then the English crown says, hey, you're English, work for us. And he's going to go and explore again. This time he's going to go up through the Labrador Sea, up through the Hudson Strait.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
That's strange, Mr. Hunt. Mr. Hudson discovered Hudson Bay. How'd that happen? Well, it wasn't Hudson Bay when he went in there. It was after. He ended up in Hudson Bay because his crew decided they didn't like him anymore and put him in a little boat and sailed away and left him, and that's the last anyone ever saw of him. For a while, they saw him madly rowing, trying to catch up with the ship, and then he gave up. There's some other people, though, that were exploring kind of on their own behalf. They were English, but they were out for money. They were pirates. Later on, when they started splitting their take with the Queen, she gave them letters of marque. That made them privateers. So now they're not pirates anymore. Now they're doing it on behalf of the Crown. John Hawkins, Francis Drake, both of them got involved a little bit in the slave trade because the Spanish were starting to bring slaves into their Caribbean holdings. We'll stop there and we'll pick up on the pirates and what have you next class on Monday. Do your stuff. Do your homework. I want to see some good grades in there this time. Did you ever get the quiz done? I don't think I have a quiz grade for you, for quiz 1.
No.
Okay, the quiz is back up. I put it up, so do it. Don't get behind.
I have a question about the quiz. Let me pull up the question.
Don't ask me about Norm Vega.
No.
Okay.
It was one of the questions on it. It says, what's the chattel slavery route?
Oh, you're talking about the second quiz.
Talking about
Okay.
the second
You had me
quiz.
confused.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, no, second quiz.
And what were the possible answers?
And, let me pull it up. The possible answers were like all those different things. I chose the Sahara one because based off of the third reading, it mentioned.
They mentioned that they had some, but that's the origins of it, but that's not what it was.
Oh, okay.
What was the question?
I'm pulling it up right now.
The first place that really developed it was in North America. But there is evidence that it may have existed in Arabs, the Chinese too, as far as that goes.
Okay. According to one of the articles, the chattel slavery appears to have developed in, and it's the Sahara Desert, the New World, the Middle East, and the southern region of Liberia. And in the third article, it says.
Sahara, and so and you answered Sahara.
Yeah, then I got it wrong.
Okay, that
I
just
was
means
wondering
that the correct answer is set wrong in the test. So I'll go back and fix that, and then you'll.
Perfect, okay,
automatically
because
be
I was
correct.
wondering, like, I thought it
Yeah,
was.
yeah,
Okay,
you're right.
perfect, thank you.
You're right. It did mention the Sahara, and it could have mentioned actually China or the Arab Peninsula.
I think it.
There's a little technical difference. Chattel slavery, the way that we talk about it, was really more developed in the Americas because laws actually surrounded it and made slaves into property.
Mhm.
In fact, slaves became subject to real estate law rather than human law.
Mhm.
In the Arabs and the Chinese and all that, they didn't care about niceties like that, so it wasn't backed up by law at all. If you were a slave, you were a slave because, and you were totally subject to a despotic monarch. So there weren't all these little niceties like that what we're talking about. We're talking about the development of chattel slavery. What Americans do and our ancestors do all the time, if you want to make something that's a little bit dodgy, that you don't think is really right, if you want to make it okay, you pass a law and say it's okay. What are we doing right now? What are we arguing about right now, right?
Yeah.
The U.S.
Right
government
now.
just sued Texas about
Yeah.
abortion, right? Whether or not it's morally right or wrong, doesn't even enter into the picture.
What, Gavin,
It's
Governor
just whether or not-
Gavin Newsom's been doing this whole
Yeah.
time too.
Yeah. Oh, all of them.
Yeah.
No matter what side you come down on, my hang up is I've always had a problem with half of the population voting on something that they're not directly involved in.
Yeah.
So that's where I have a hang up. So I kind of like to say it's in between the individual, and if it's a mortal sin, then
Yeah.
that's your problem.
Mhm.
Lightning may strike later on, but my daughter and I get in ferocious arguments about that.
Mhm.
She's, on that subject, she's human. About human rights, she's not much more liberal than me, but she comes across looking that way.
Mhm.
She's actually brought up as a good little conservative child, so. And she actually knows what that means. Most of our conservative friends around here don't even know what being a conservative is.
No.
I'm a conservative, I don't know what a conservative is, but I are one.
But I are one.
You look at all the signs when people are running for office. It always says conservative on there.
And they are not conservative.
It's lucky they didn't have to make their own sign because they probably couldn't have even spelled it right.
I'll need another one of these.
I get really angry about it because of all these people that make believe or they claim to be conservative so they can get elected. And like a certain president we had who was a Democrat all his life and suddenly declares I'm a Republican.
Have a good weekend.
Take care. Stay safe.